The summer of 1945 was not a time of blossoming, but of gray exhaustion. Europe lay in ruins and the German regime had surrendered. But in the Pacific, the war continued to devour what little hope remained. It was a war of islands taken yard by yard, where every inch of sand had been soaked in mutual sacrifice. The American war machine was advancing inexorably toward Japan, the homeland, and beyond the military logic, a question of weight lingered. At what precise cost would the final battle be won? In that spring, the final dilemma of the war, the invasion of the Japanese archipelago, began to be quantified by weary-eyed men, bent over maps in Pearl Harbor and Washington. Operation Downfall was the code name, a designation that, in retrospect, sounded more like a biblical omen. The plan had two phases: Operation Olympic, the invasion of Kyushu Island, the southern third of Japan, and Operation Coronet, the assault on the Kanto Plain near Tokyo. The numbers were, from the start, disturbing, but even so, they began from a point that we now know was dangerously wrong. American intelligence had decrypted the Japanese code, which provided a window into the enemy's strategic structure. However, no matter how competent the cryptographers were, the battlefield is a living organism, not a radio transcript. Initially, enemy defense estimates for Kyushu invasion, Operation Olympic, pointed to an assault force of about 296,000 men, organized into no more than 7 divisions. It was a terrifying figure, certainly, but still within the parameters of a land battle, for which America was prepared to commit over 1 million combatants, equipped with the highest war technology. What followed was not a gradual shift, but a dizzying escalation of strategic paranoia, a tale of logistical horror. Intelligence reports, instead of calming, began to converge on a much bleaker scenario. As time passed, and the enemy prepared, the figures leaped alarmingly. 7 divisions became 10, then 12. The Imperial Japanese Army Command, under the direction of the Imperial General Headquarters, was adopting the Ketsugo strategy, the decisive operation, a total, fanatical defense of the homeland. In a bunker in Advanced Command Center, an intelligence analyst reviewed the estimates, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose, the cigarette burning forgotten in the ashtray. He was a man accustomed to dealing with numbers that represented lives, but these numbers made him tremble. Every new radio intercept, every fragment of aerial reconnaissance contradicted the last. It wasn't 7 divisions, nor 12. They were pulling men from all over China and Korea. Japan wasn't waiting on the beach. It was turning the island into a swamp of mines, shelters, and fanatical resistance. The real number of defenders for Operation Olympic jumped from 296,000 to over 500,000, then 600,000. The last estimate I signed before I felt sick pointed to about 900,000 regular troops, not counting the millions of civilian militias, children, and women armed with bamboo, and a determination bordering on religious suicide. It is in this abyss between what is expected and what actually exists that strategy falls apart, giving way to the cold math of carnage. The initial miscalculation was not just a lapse of intelligence. It was a failure to understand a degree of desperation and fanaticism driving the Japanese defense. They were not fighting to win, but to die. And, in dying, they wanted to take as many enemies with them as possible. This bleak picture had a direct impact on the United States Navy. Operation Olympic would require an unprecedented assault fleet, involving the bulk of the Pacific Fleet. The reality of coastal defense with nearly 1 million combatants, supported by an enemy force planning to use thousands of suicide planes, the kamikazes, demanded a massive naval contingent. The initial estimate for the number of American sailors involved in the landing phase was around 250,000, but with the updating of enemy forces and the need for more and more support ships, escorts, amphibious assault ships, hospital ships, and logistical support, the number of sailors required for Operation Downfall as a whole, Olympic and Coronet, swelled to over 2 million souls aboard. 2 million sailors on ships that would be within devastating range of Japan's last line of air defense. The psychological tension hung like a salty mist over the aircraft carrier decks. The men knew the invasion of Europe had been terrible, but they were preparing for something that had no precedent. Okinawa had been the prologue, a battle where proportion of casualties from kamikaze planes was the highest of the entire war. The Japanese homeland would be Okinawa multiplied by 100. A naval reconnaissance pilot, tasked with low-altitude flights over Kyushu, reported what he saw in his logbook. The precision of military language was insufficient for what he had witnessed. What I saw up there wasn't just fortifications. The topography had been reshaped. Every hill was an artillery cocoon. Entire railway lines had been dismantled to make barricades. I saw empty villages where the children and elderly seemed to have been evacuated, leaving only armed young men digging trenches with their hands. The density of what was being prepared was palpable. It wasn't a defense. It was a promise of mutual annihilation. I returned to the carrier, and the silence in my squadron was heavier than the roar of the engines. We knew there would be no land to run to. This sensory perception that the war would no longer be fought with strategy, but with the simple mass destruction of bodies, permeated the high echelons. The division general, who had planned crucial battles in Europe, now faced the prospect of a landing force that, in its first week, could suffer more casualties than the entire Normandy campaign. The calculation changed from how to win to how many will we lose. When intelligence delivered the number of 2 million sailors, just to support the offensive, and naval casualty estimates soared over 50,000 in the first month due to suicide attacks, we realized we were on the verge of disaster. Admirals were no longer concerned with the enemy, but with the survival of the fleet itself. A soldier's loyalty is one thing, but commander's responsibility is another. To send men into a known meat grinder just because it is the only remaining order, between obeying orders and preserving the power of the Navy for the future of the free world, many discovered that the hardest war was the one they fought inside themselves. The moral dilemma was not defeat, but victory at an unsustainable sacrifice. The Navy was willing to give ships and lives, but the projected cost for Operation Downfall as a whole, total casualties, summing Army and Navy, reached staggering millions. The official number, though hidden from the public, was that total American losses could range from 500,000 to over 1 million combatants, with Japanese estimates exceeding 5 to 10 million, the majority being civilians. It is at this point that military math meets philosophy and faith. On a hospital ship anchored in the rear, a military chaplain wrote a note to his wife, which would later be found among his belongings. He was preparing men for death in a way he never had before. Faith becomes a boat in the storm. They don't ask me about heaven, but about purpose. Why this horror? Why this last step into hell? I tell them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision that something is more important than it. But the truth I cannot tell them is that sometimes purpose runs out. The only remaining purpose is to keep the other alive. The air here smells of metal, silence, and an unspoken prayer. Today, I saw a young sailor polish his boots with reverent care. He said, "I want them to be clean when I wear them for the last time." It is the solitude of war, the feeling that the signal is being sent to a world that perhaps no longer exists to answer. The chaplain's reflection is an echo that still resonates. When sacrifice reaches a point of saturation, when the cost of victory outweighs any tactical or moral benefit, the leadership is forced to consider the unthinkable. Loyalty to the mission clashes with loyalty to life. The general, the admiral, and the president sat under the weight of the statistic that had jumped from 296,000 offenders to the prospect of a confrontation with over 2 million Japanese combatants, regular and militia, and 2 million American sailors in the cauldron. This new reality was no longer a military matter, but a decision of an existential nature. The counted offenders of ships, of lives, had reached a threshold that demanded a radical and immediate alternative. The engines briefly fell silent in the command rooms, and the silence was scarier than the thunder of the cannon. The war no longer shouted. It whispered. What happened next would change the world forever, but the weight of that count of 2 million American sailors at the mercy of a desperate and fanatical enemy was a decisive factor. The discovery of the true scale of Operation Ketsugo, the total Japanese defense, imposed a crisis of conscience and calculation on Washington. The increase in defense estimates in Kyushu to nearly 1 million regular troops, coupled with the mass use of suicide tactics and the mobilization of millions of civilians, transformed Operation Downfall from a plan for victory into a ritual of mutual sacrifice. The count of more than 2 million American sailors concentrated in the assault area to support the offensive meant that the United States Navy would be exposed to an unacceptable, perhaps lethal level of risk to its future operational capability. What intelligence discovered was not a plan, but a trap. When loyalty to the mission becomes a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of men, what remains of the freedom of choice? The central dilemma lay in the difference between political victory and military survival. America would win the war if it invaded Japan, but the price would be the disintegration of its own assault force, a sacrifice few leaders dare to contemplate. General Marshall and Admiral Nimitz were pragmatic men, but even pragmatism had limits in the face of casualty projections counted in the millions, adding up both sides in conflict. In this vacuum of viable alternatives, the Los Alamos Laboratory, until then a deep and almost mythical secret, emerged from the underground of strategy. The alternative to Operation Downfall would not come from a reformulated battle plan, but from a technological leap that challenged the very morality of war. The Manhattan Project was the only variable capable of altering the cost/benefit calculation that condemned millions of lives in the invasion. The turning point was not a moment of heroism in the field, but a series of cold meetings in closed rooms, where emotion was constrained by the need for decision. The pressure of the numbers was the catalyst. If Operation Olympic proceeded with current defense projections, it was inevitable that naval losses, especially those caused by the thousands of kamikazes saved for final defense, would paralyze the fleet. The possibility of losing 50,000 sailors in a month, in addition to Army losses, was a statistic that no leader could simply sign off on. Throughout the war, the truth was fragmented into short diaries and reports. Each record is an echo of conscience, a vestige of a generation that lived the unspeakable with simple words. In a top-secret memo declassified decades later, the chief cryptographer of the Decryption Project wrote, "We gave them the count, but the truth was not in the division numbers, but in what they were willing to do with them. War was no longer about strategy. It was about absolute will. The invasion, as planned, would be the greatest loss of naval lives in American history. The only way to stop this sacrifice machine was with something that would paralyze it not just logistically, but psychologically. Our reports were the last word that military reason could offer." The historian comments, language at this moment becomes a shield. Suffering turns into a number, and the number erases a face. The bureaucracy of the telegram was the last barrier between the reality of pain and the brutal decision. In contrast, the voice of war was heard in the ports of embarkation, where innocence mingled with resignation. From a report by the military chaplain accompanying the troops bound for Pacific, a phrase of deep melancholy survives. They prepare the ships as if they were going on a trip, but their silence is a different kind of prayer. I saw a young sailor, before embarking for the unknown, leave a small bell on the shore. He said, "I wanted to ring earlier than it should, perhaps to remember that we are still alive, that there is still time." The historian reflects. Even in the darkness, humanity creates rituals to remember itself. It is the last act of resistance, the act of feeling and hoping for a sign. The decision was made. The alternative to the invasion and the resulting massive carnage for the assault forces and the 2 million supporting sailors would be the use of new weapons. The choice was not between war and peace, but between a catastrophe with a long and predictable time horizon and an instant catastrophe whose strategic consequences could force an immediate surrender. The climax came in the form of 2 detonations that redefined the concept of conflict. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki fulfilled the function that pure military force refused to perform: total psychological paralysis. The impact of these weapons exceeded all tactical expectations, exposing Japan's final vulnerability and, crucially, offering the imperial leadership an honorable way out of defense strategy that had already condemned millions of its own citizens. Japan's surrender, a few days after the second attack, marked not only the end of World War II but the beginning of a new era of strategic anxiety. General Omar Bradley would later reflect on the nature of modern war. "The only thing worse than winning a war is losing one." But the war in the Pacific had reached a point where the terror of winning the invasion was what had forced the nuclear alternative. The count of 2 million American sailors under threat of massive annihilation weighed more than any other statistic. The strategic outcome was unambiguous: Operation Downfall, with its projections of losses on a biblical scale, was permanently canceled. The tactical victory was absolute, achieved at a cost in American lives infinitely lower than predicted for the invasion. However, moral loss was the price paid for this economy of lives. Triumph was not accompanied by pure celebration, but by a frightened silence before the newly unleashed power. The engines have fallen silent, but the echo of the choices made in that summer of 1945 still resonates in the memory of humanity. The legacy of the decision to use atomic weapons is inextricably linked to numbers that military intelligence revealed about Operation Ketsugo and, in particular, to the unsustainable risk imposed on the 2 million American sailors designated for Operation Downfall. It was not the thirst for destruction that led to the bomb, but the dreadful mathematics of survival. History teaches us that courage often resides not in the attack, but in the decision to retreat from predictable catastrophe. Operation Downfall was destined to be a ritual sacrifice, and the atomic alternative, however terrible, offered a sudden interruption to the self-perpetuating cycle of violence. It is a moral paradox that the greatest demonstration of destructive force was, from this cold, military perspective, an act of preventing a much greater loss of life. The event forces us to confront the nature of war and morality. When suffering is a certainty, the choice boils down to what type of suffering is the least destructive to the fabric of civilization. The legacy is not only in the ruins of 2 Japanese cities, but also in the lives of the 2 million sailors who were spared an amphibious hell, and in the millions of Japanese lives that would have been lost in the fanatical defense of their soil. Today, when we look at maps of Japan and the archive plans of Operation Downfall, we are reminded that war is ultimately a set of impossible choices. Faith in technology solved a military dilemma, but created an ethical dilemma that remains with us today. The soldiers' diaries, the strategist's memos, and the chaplain's prayers reveal humanity trapped between obedience and conscience. The snow of the following winter erased the soldiers' footprints and the steam from the ships, but not the weight of the decisions that were made there. The bell rings in Japan to remember the victims of the bomb, and rings in the West to remember those who did not have to fight. And in that double echo lies the final lesson. The only lasting victory in war is the survival of memory, which forces us to remember the total cost of all choices made in the darkness. The drama of war is not in celebration, but in the silent reflection on what we were forced to do to survive.